At first glance, Control might seem like a very typical third-person shooter. I mean, the game even starts in an aggressively bland office building. But it's all a setup for misdirection. So here's why you should play Control. Control is one of those games I'd heard things about here and there, and they were all generally very positive, but I never took the time to sit down and play it. And boy am I glad I did. But if the game came out in 2019, why talk about it now? Well, throughout the month of November, Control is free on Amazon Prime Games. So if you've been thinking about playing Control, or if this is the first you've heard of it, take this as your sign to pick it up. So let's get into it. Also, as a heads up, there will be some spoilers ahead. So after some basic tutorial stuff, Control sets itself up as a pretty typical over-the-shoulder shooter. The main character, Jesse Faden, is scheming her way into this mysterious government agency. Along the way, you got a cool gun, which becomes very useful in taking down swarms of your zombie analogs, but Control pretty quickly goes off the rails in the best possible way. You start to learn more of the nature of the Federal Bureau of Control, or the FBC, and the extra-dimensional paranormal things they've been working with. The interior space of the building seems off from the very beginning, but as you progress deeper into the building, reality breaks completely and you start to have to fight off the hiss in order to seize control of the area and return it to its stable state. All of this would be interesting enough, but Jesse pretty quickly learns about the main job of the FBC, and that's controlling what they call objects of power. These objects were at the center of some huge paranormal event and have absorbed some of that essence, granting the object itself some unusual powers. As Jesse acquires these objects, she will gain these new powers like telekinesis, speed burst, mind control, levitation, and others. Each time you'll level up, and also from various side missions, of which there are plenty, you gain points to spend towards upgrading yourself and your powers. And since each power has its own upgrade tree, you can really focus on the power you like best. During my playthrough, I went mostly telekinesis and shotgun, so I put all of my points into improving the damage of my telekinesis and my energy consumption. But there are also plenty of other options, some of which are completely optional. Which brings us to sometimes a term gets thrown around so much to where its exact meaning becomes a little muddled. That, I feel, has happened with the term Metroidvania. But to me, Metroidvanias are games which encourage exploration through progression and not through curiosity. With open world games like Skyrim or Breath of the Wild, the player wants to explore to know what's over that next hill. In Metroidvanias like Control, and yes, it is a Metroidvania, exploration is encouraged by the player's desire to progress forward. Throughout the game, Jesse will run into some obstacles that she can't bypass. She'll have to backtrack to find some new ability, then return to the obstacle and use that new ability to get through it. And if that's not the bread and butter of a Metroidvania, I don't know what is. But Control throws in a lot more than it needs to. There are several optional powers Jesse can acquire throughout the game, but without a helpful fairy to guide the way, it's wholly up to the player to notice that impossibly high ledge and make a mental note of it to return there later, once levitation is gained. The controls in Control are tight and responsive, and at least on the mouse and keyboard I was using, I never felt like a death was the fault of not having enough dexterity to input what I needed to in that moment. It was always from getting too overeager and running into a room full of hiss and not having a plan. The powers you can gain are all very useful. I never used the shield, but that's just me. They lend themselves to different playstyles and tactics, and having options on how to play is always a good thing. Games like BioShock certainly laid the groundwork for a game with guns and spell-like abilities, but Control does a really great job of making these abilities flow together seamlessly. Using telekinesis to fling one enemy into another and then finishing them both off with a shotgun to the head just feels satisfying, even without any sort of combo bonus or anything. And it gets even better the more guns and powers you unlock and upgrade. I asserted earlier that Control is a Metroidvania, and it is. But it doesn't lean into those roots hard enough. Many of the story progression moments are blocked off via just security keys. I would have loved to seen more obstacles being overcome by Jessie's acquired powers, versus just some keycard being handed to you by a security officer. You could be cynical about it and say how mechanically it's the same thing, whether a blocked passage is unlocked by a key or a power, but in a game about starting with nothing and gradually gaining new powers, it makes the player feel more in control when they get to use those powers to solve puzzles in any sort of capacity, rather than the throw a block at the node puzzles which show up far too often in Control. I would have loved to have seen more progression through these gained powers. Also in that same vein, I'm not a fan of any fast travel system, and I would have much preferred the game to include shortcuts which also utilize those powers to access. Overall, Control is still a really solid game. Maybe it doesn't lean into the Metroidvania gameplay mechanics and style as hard as I would have liked, but I can't blame the game for not living up to my expectations of it. Even without any of those mechanics, Control offers engaging gameplay, exciting combat, and an intriguing story that will have players constantly questioning everything.